Okay, welcome to Chapter 2, where again, if you're joining us out of sequence or order, this is for the class CJC 111, Introduction to Criminal Justice here at Wake Tech. Um, Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2, which is really about the causes of crime. I picked the little picture of someone using essentially anti-disinfectant or disinfectant in order to show, the complexities, what causes things. We're just coming out of the COVID epidemic, so a lot of people were skeptical about what causes it and how to prevent it. And I think that's actually not a bad thing to talk about in context when we look at some of the causes of crime, certainly some of the theories. Okay, so some questions to ask before we really start here. Um, why are we developing a theory of crime? One of the questions I frequently get from students is, this is all very theoretical, Mr. Chapman. This is all, something that isn't practical as, I kind of expect in this type of level course. And my answer to that is theory can be really important because if theory will tell you why something happens, you're halfway to understanding how to prevent it. So if you could come up with a general theory of crime, why people rob, why people kill, why people steal, then you might be able to prevent them from robbing, killing, and stealing. Which is not to say that there is a general theory for all types of crime, because I do think that, there's a big difference between why someone commits a crime of rape versus commits a larceny or a theft versus a murder. Is it possible that there's no explanation or general theory of crime? And I think this is something that can be difficult for those of us in the West to accept. Because we want to believe very often that if I can ask a question, a question of any degree of logic, then there's going to be an answer to that question. There's going to be an explanation. And, that's great. I think it works for a lot of the natural world, but it may not work for some of the theoretical or motivational world, I would call it. So that's something we can explore here. What assumptions or blind spots might we have that could lead us into error here? We all come in, and I've told you this starting the first chapter, with preconceptions. We're certainly coming into the area of theory and motivation with preconceptions, and we're probably more comfortable with those preconceptions and less subject to challenge than in some other fields, because we feel like, well, I've lived a life. I understand how people in the world works. The final question to ask, and I think it's a fair question, is empirical data, or what you could more accurately, I guess, call objective data, better than subjective? Is it better to look at the big picture or the small picture? Is it better to look at outside a person's skull or inside a person's skull? And is this true in all cases? So just some questions to look at. Again, these learning objectives really not important for most of you. They're really just hopefully what we want to accomplish in this chapter as they relate to the course goals. Okay, the role of theory and criminology. What is criminology? Well, criminology is the scientific study of crime and causes of criminal behavior. And the people who do this are criminologists. Now, this is a difficult field because you're studying human beings. When you study human beings, you can't study human beings like you could study the COVID plague, or you could study, the theory of gravity, or you could study, chemical reactions where you can add or subtract more sodium to a solution to see what happens. You can't experiment with human beings, certainly without their consent, and you can't conduct certain experiments that would potentially answer questions because they're immoral. Also, I think we have to accept that there is multiple explanations for a single event. If I tell you, why did he rob the bank? One person might say, well, he robbed the bank because he chose to rob the bank. That would be the free will. Other people would say, well, no, he robbed the bank because he was poor and needed the money, and that would be kind of a sociological explanation. And I think, to some extent, both of those can be true. So I don't want you to be trapped inside the idea that it's always one or the other of these theories. Okay. The next thing I want to make clear here is And like a lot of vocabulary in a lot of fields, there's a difference between what the the popular use of a term means, and what the field use of that term means. So, for most people, when they say a theory, they're really saying, I have a guess. Um, and the further back in time you go, if you go back to the 1800s, the 1700s, even when you're dealing in areas of science, the theories really are little better than guesses. Modern scientific theory is something much different. And the National Academy of Science gives us a definition that says some scientific explanations, theories, are so well established that no new evidence is likely to alter them, alter the theory, that is. A comprehensive explanation of an important feature of nature supported by facts gathered over time. That's a theory. So, theories, most importantly, and this is why they have use for us in this field, allow us to make predictions about the future or the results. So they can tell us, okay, how do I prevent crime? How do I stop people from murder, rape, arson, or we're just after some tragic mass shootings in Buffalo, among other places, mass shootings. Okay, a couple things to throw in here: correlation and causation, because these can be confusing to students. Correlation is the relationship between two events, two measurements that move in the same direction. So we have the idea that many people suffer from postpartum depression, post-birth depression, and infanticide, killing of a child. That does not mean that postpartum causes violent behavior. There might instead be some factor that underlies both those things. You're getting depressed because there's a hormonal imbalance. That hormonal imbalance is also driving the infanticide. So the postpartum becomes a symptom of one thing, and the infanticide becomes a symptom of something else. So there's a correlation between those two, but they're not causation. And this is really tricky when you're dealing with human beings. It can be very difficult to tease out, okay, what is a correlation and what is a causation? Now, sometimes it's pretty easy. Two things occurring in concert doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other, but sometimes it's more difficult. Okay, so also talk about theories and hypotheses. Theories are much more robust. They have strong evidence to support them. So let's take a theory that no one would really object to in 21st century America: the theory of gravity. The theory of gravity doesn't completely explain gravity. We've still got some very fundamental questions about where gravity comes from and how it works, but you notice that we have a very robust body of evidence about how gravity works. So we can do things like shoot spaceships to the moon, or we can shoot artillery shells in the Ukraine. And we can apply the theory of gravity as we understand it to the greater world, the real world, if you will, and it functions very well. Now, hypotheses are a little bit different. Hypotheses kind of come before theory in modern scientific parlance. Hypotheses are possible explanations that can be tested and can either evolve into a theory or be discarded. And sometimes when they evolve into a theory, they displace other theories. So you might come up with a hypothesis. I think that the diabetes epidemic in the United States is being caused by a bacterial infection. That's a hypothesis. And maybe you say, well, I've tested 1,000 people that have diabetes, and they all seem to have this germ or this bacteria. Well, you then would have a hypothesis. You don't have a theory yet because you've got to show that it's not a correlative event, but a causative event. And then would have to show the relationship between the two. Okay. Another thing I want to emphasize here is old theory versus new theory. I kind of talked about this at the beginning, but many older theories were really first created when science was really in its infancy, when modern science. So they have been discredited, altered, or sometimes proved true, but modified. The reason for this is a lot of these older theories were based upon very inadequate data, or simply just false assumptions. People just assumed something to be true as a given. They didn't investigate it or examine it, and the result is they got it wrong. Now, Some theories can be heavily modified. So early theories of gravity, well, certainly true. I mean, if you, it's not exactly true, but if you look at the theory of gravities developed by Sir Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton came up with some ideas about gravity. Um, and by and large, many of them have survived being tested and refined. Now, a lot of Newtonian physics was challenged in the 20th century. Sometimes it's referred to as Einstein's physics or Einsteinian physics. And it had to be modified. They kind of exist together at different scales in the universe. So old theories can survive or they can die out. Because sometimes we say, well, we have this theory that, there's a very old criminological theory that crime is caused by and can be examined through feeling someone's skull. I know this sounds crazy, but believe it or not, I think this science was called phrenology, where they would feel the bumps on a person's skull and they could say, okay, well, you got this bump here, that means you're violent. You got this bump here, that means. Now, that's just crazy. Okay? But it limped along for a while, and then gradually people said, look, there's simply no evidence of this. We have to throw it away. Okay. So let's start looking at the beginning. And again, these are these early theories, and you'll see the dates here. These are these early theories, the classical theory of an explanation for crime. The classical theory of criminology is free will. Why did Peter rob the bank? He robbed the bank because he chose to rob the bank. Why did John kill Mary? He killed Mary because of his own free will. He decided to kill her. Now, obviously, this idea in general of free will has been around for thousands of years. As it is applied to the criminological field, it was largely developed by a man named Cesare Beccaria, writing in the 1700s. And he basically says, look, all decisions are the result of rational choice. You weigh the pros and the cons, and you choose to do things. You don't do certain things because you're afraid of punishment. And this is the idea of deterrent. The more certain, the more swift, and the more harsh the punishment, the less likely you commit crime. And this is in part to explain, although there's a lot of historical reasons for this, this is in part to explain why if you look at penalties in the 17 and 1800s, they would seem barbarically severe to us today. But part of the idea behind that was, okay, by having quick punishments, very quick trials with very few rights, and very harsh punishments, lots of capital offenses. You could be executed for lots of things in many countries, still can. That would lower crime. So, free will is a foundational theory. Now, this is a picture of his book, Crimes and Punishments, and Cesare Beccaria was an Italian. He wrote during what is called the Enlightenment. At the same time in America that you have the Declaration of Independence, you have Thomas Paine's Common Sense, you have all these writings. You have really Beccaria writing as a contemporary. Okay. Another man, Cesare Lombroso, who is largely credited as being the father of criminology, kind of de-emphasized free will. And you can see because we've got a photograph of him, he writes much later. He says, crime is much more complex. Crime is the result of biological, psychological, and social forces. So he didn't discount and say there's no free will. He just said it's not the end all and be all. And his theory was called positivism. And positivism became very important inside the criminology field. I don't think it really became as important outside of the field as it was inside, because people began to say, well, yeah, this makes a lot of sense if they studied it. But most people, I think, still fell back to the idea of, why did John kill Mary? He chose to kill Mary. Now, I think in part because of this, people began to challenge positivism. And John Q. Wilson, a fairly famous scientist, argued that no, we can really go back and look at Beccaria. We can refine this form a little bit better. And he created what he called rational choice theory, free will again. And he said, look, if the benefits of crime outweigh the penalties, people will commit crime. Some people commit crimes because they seek the thrill. The thrill is the benefit. And the modern rational choice theory, which is more complex than that early theory that Cesare developed, Cesare Beccaria, modern rational choice theory is the dominant theory in the American criminal justice system. Americans, in the application of theory, if you could describe it as such, will say you can punish an individual and you should punish an individual because it will prevent future crimes and because they chose to commit this crime. This is John Q. Wilson. And one of the things that Wilson, he's an American, still alive today. I think he's still alive today. I've seen videos, tapes of his lectures, never attended one. He's an early proponent of something called the broken window theory. And you can see how this is a theory that we would apply under rational choice, and then it would have an impact on policing, and it would have an impact on trials and incarceration. So he came up with what's sometimes called the broken window theory, very early proponent of it. He said, consider a building with a few broken windows. If the windows are not repaired, then vandals will break a few more. Eventually, they'll break into the building. If it's unoccupied, squatters will come in. There'll be fires. Or a sidewalk where litter accumulates, then more litter, then trash. And then finally, there is crime. They might use that building for a drug house, or they might use that trash as cover to commit crime. So Wilson is a proponent that as the people, if you deal with them early with their choices, you can in some ways limit those choices and get them not to commit crime. Okay. Now, there are other theories, and I don't want you to think that these theories are what I would call exclusive theories. These theories are not to say that the only reason people do things is because of biology, or the only reason people do things because of neurocriminology. So let's look at each of these. Biological theories focus on ideas like genetics, hormones, and brain chemistry. So probably one of the most fascinating series of studies, and there was a very large Danish study that did this, is they took identical twins, some identical, some not in other studies, and they separated them at birth. So they said, okay, let's take twin A and twin B. And twin A is raised in a privileged environment. And twin B's environment is not so privileged. Maybe he's poor. Maybe he has a violent father. Maybe he has an absent mother. Maybe he is exposed early to substance abuse. And A has a good education and a stable home environment. What they showed in some of these studies is the level of criminology was similar in both groups. So that would tend to mean that environment is not important as some sort of genetics, because these are identicals. Now, psychological theories look at mental processes and behavior which can shape and be shaped by biological. So this is sometimes called neurochemical. There's a fairly famous case where this man began to develop an unhealthy interest in pre-adolescent children, essentially pedophilia. And he had exhibited none of this, and he was finally accused, I believe, of something. And while he was in court, he actually suffered some sort of stroke. Turned out he had a brain tumor. They removed the brain tumor. All his desires for pedophilia disappear. Fast forward a few months or years later, he begins to develop those same feelings again. He goes in, and sure enough, the tumor had reemerged in the same area of the brain. Now, this is a single incident. This is not a general theory, but what it's showing you is, there is an internal factor here linked to your brain, neuro means brain or nerve, that seems to be triggering some type of behavior which is deemed to be criminal. Okay, recent studies have shown some very strong links to genes and crime, and this is unsurprising because you got to remember that really we don't have modern DNA. Well, we understood genetics to some extent very early on. There's the Mendelssohn experiments that go way, way back, performed by a monk. But we don't have really the double helix DNA model until the 1960s, Watson and Crick. So even if you discover something in, say, 1965 or 1970, you can bet that it's going to take years and years and years, 20, 30, 40 years for us to exploit this. So a number of these scientists, and I listed them, for example, one of them showed very strong links to extreme violence in prisoners that have a genetic link at CDH13. Um, Another scientist showed that the serotonin receptor gene, again, showed an increased likelihood of impulsive crimes and substance abuse, which is really interesting because that may mean a predisposition. Chen showed that the MOA gene, just a gene in the DNA sequence, showed increased levels of aggression, not necessarily increased levels of crime. And Brunner showed that generational violence in the Dutch family could be linked to the loss of a particular gene, monoamine oxidase A, and those studies were done in 1993. Now, this is still in its infancy, but what it would mean is that the level of crime can be reflective of genetics, and one of the ways you would treat that is you would attempt to, say, replace whatever. If this, let's suppose this serotonin receptor, and I'm not overly familiar with that work, let's suppose that serotonin receptor didn't allow people to take up serotonin or let them take up too much serotonin. Well, you could either decrease or increase the serotonin among people that show this propensity and hopefully prevent them from committing crime. Okay, this kind of segues us into mental illness. Now, a link has been established between some crimes and schizophrenia. Now, I do want to emphasize that most schizophrenics are not dangerous people. In fact, most schizophrenics are more likely to be victims than they are to be perpetrators of crimes. However, many people who commit serious mass crimes have been shown to suffer from some type of schizophrenia or mental illness. Again, it's difficult to assess this role. It's very difficult to look at mental illness because one of the things is there's no consistent accepted definition of normal. I think what most people find when they start to look at the mental illness field is almost all mental traits. And you could take a very basic one like, do you like spicy foods? You might think, well, that's, or maybe that's not a good one. Let's suppose if we talked about your sexuality. Do you like men or do you like women? Now, most people seem to identify on a scale where they are attracted to members of the opposite gender. Most people are heterosexual. However, even the strongest heterosexual can appreciate the beauty of someone or the attractiveness or the majesty of someone of his same gender or her same gender. Conversely, even someone who is LGBT or gay could appreciate the beauty of a member of the opposite gender. Doesn't mean they're sexually attracted to them, does mean that on this scale of what is the normal understanding of your attractiveness to your own gender, one is at one level, one is at the other. Okay, social, psychological, and trait theories. Social psychological focuses on how we act in groups. And there's a very famous experiment by Philip Zimbardo, who demonstrated that individuals will commit acts of violence, even torture, potentially murder, if they are ordered to by someone they recognize as someone in authority, or if they're in a group that seems to be pressing us toward this. Now, trait theory, a little bit different, looks for traits or tendencies to commit crime and seeks to eliminate them from either the individual or society. Now, this was pretty unpopular in a lot of ways, but there has developed by the late 20th, early 21st century a psychological field called cognitive behavior therapy, and that seems to be a little bit more acceptable. And I'm going to use a very crude example. There's an old expression that there's two wolves inside. There's two people inside you. One is a wolf, right? And one is a lamb. And the question is, which one are you? And the answer is, which one do you feed? I know which one do you emphasize? Which one do you identify with? Which one do you practice? If you can cognitively get people to recognize that their behavior of, say, violence is inappropriate and get them to practice being more peaceful, you might get them to modify behavior. That's cognitive behavior therapy. And that's a very crude example. Okay, this is the Stanford prison experiment, and this is a fascinating one. This is Zimbardo again, and what he did was he took two college students. This is out in Stanford, California, I believe, and two groups of college students, and he said, okay, some of you are going to be prisoners, and some of you are going to be guards. So he broke them up, and they hadn't committed any crimes, but they just kind of were randomly assigned, and they put them in a fake jail over a weekend. Gradually, the guards began to identify the prisoners as bad people. They started to abuse them. The prisoners started to act out. Eventually, they had to stop the experiment, believe it or not. And part of this was really the recognition that, oh my God, people will start to act in what's sometimes called groupthink. They'll just obey the group. They'll identify with who they are. Okay, so let's focus on not the individual so much, because sometimes you can say, why did something happen? You focus on the individual. Sometimes you pull back and you look at the larger society. So some of these theories are fairly early, some a little bit late. One of the earlier ones, social disorganization, is called the Chicago School, in part because it came out of some studies from Chicago and where they were, neighborhoods. But essentially it argued that bad neighborhoods breed crime and criminal behavior. So if you live in a disadvantaged neighborhood where there's limited opportunities, your peer group is disorganized, and you are far more likely to become a criminal. Another theory is called the strain theory. Now, this is developed by a man named Emil Durkheim, and he used the concept of the nome, the individual who really could not achieve success, and because he was isolated from the success, because he was isolated from society, this caused a breakdown of what was normal or acceptable behavior, and he would often try to achieve what he deemed to be success outside the bounds of the law. Cultural deviance theory says subgroups emerge that treat violent and criminal behavior as normal or acceptable. So you can look at some groups. There was an old movie. It's a pretty good movie called Fight Club. I don't know if you all have seen it. But basically, the accepting of the idea that it was fun or pleasurable or desirable to engage in fights. Now that's a violent behavior, not fights for profit, I guess, but fights because it's ideal. So you can have these subgroups emerge, and this might be a subgroup that emerges that says drugs are good, or sexual conquest, something like that. Sexual attacks are good. So preventing crime in these types of theories would be centered around improving the social and economic and the living conditions of people in order to remove the preconditions to this. Okay, so social conflict theory developed out of the nome and the strain theory, but with greater embracing of class conflict. Now, part of this is a bleed over from Marxism. Karl Marx was a philosopher, both a social philosopher, a political philosopher, an economic philosopher, who has been credited with the creation of modern communism. There's a lot of strains to this, and I'm not going to go too far down it, but essentially Marx saw crime as a class conflict issue. So you could reduce it very simply. You could say, why do people steal? They steal because other people have stuff that they don't. So the social conflict theories would also say there's an emphasis on who's in control and using the criminal law as a tool to control those without power. And this can be reflected in racial treat theory or threat theory. And we're punching around the edge of this, that the criminal law is a tool to maintain white dominance. Now, sometimes that's shockingly obvious. You can go to our history and you can say, well, what are the Jim Crow laws? Why are they there? Well, they're clearly there to maintain white supremacy. It's a little bit less obvious when those are removed and potentially code words or code behaviors put in its place. So social conflict theory has largely been rejected by those in power. Now, maybe it's because we have integrated more minorities and females into running the criminal justice system. Maybe it's because Marx has come under legitimate criticism for much of his political philosophy and thought. Okay, some other ones. Life lesson, criminal behavior, social process theories. Crime is a result of how you interact with your environment. So Sutherland came up with a fascinating one called the learning theory. And he says, look, you have to learn to become a criminal. And the way I talk about this to students is, think about something that many of you experience, either smoking your first cigarette or drinking your first beer. Now let's suppose those two things were illegal. The first time you used a cigarette or you had a beer, it's not necessarily a pleasurable experience. But what you learn to do is that you learn that, oh my God, yeah, this cigarette is great. I really enjoy it. Oh, it just, relaxes me. Or, oh, this beer is wonderful. I'm really appreciating the flavor of the hops and stuff. But it takes a while. So he would say the same thing is true of crime. You have to learn to become a criminal. Now, the control theory says crime occurs when restraints or controls are weak. And that's an interesting one because, again, this harkens back at least in part to these ideas of things like the Chicago School, these bad neighborhoods. You got the labeling theory that says when you identify a group or an individual as a criminal or a criminal class, they begin to behave that way. And there's kind of that famous experiment where teachers would divide classes between students with blue eyes and students with brown eyes, and they would say, oh, you blue-eyed students have turned out to be so much smarter than the brown-eyed students, and they would focus more attention on them, and they would, sure enough, they began to perform better in school. And the brown-eyed students who were told, oh, you're bad, you're stupid, you're subpar, they started to perform worse and have more behavioral issues. So if we look at public policy here, you would focus more on saving juveniles and preventing the formation of these bad habits, or these labels. Life course theories of crime. And I know I'm throwing a lot of different theories at you, and I hate to break it to you, but I am just skimming the very top of these. You could spend an entire lifetime studying self-control theory or the strain theory, or certainly Marxism. So I'm just able to touch the top of these. Self-control says largely that those with low self-control, impulse control, these can be thrill seekers. And I think this theory is helpful to us if we look at it, because you can be poorly socialized, you can turn to crime here, is I think it would also tend to harken back to other things and show you how some of these theories can interconnect. So suppose under Gottfried's theory, we say, okay, crime can be charged by low self-control. Well, where does that come from? Does it come from genetics? Does it come from learned behavior? So you can see how these theories can interact and build with each other. Also, yeah, if you're talking about a criminal who kills for the thrill of it, okay, that's one thing. But what about if you're talking about an accountant who steals money because his wife needs drugs to stay alive and he doesn't have insurance? Those are still crimes, and I think this also points out something in a lot of the theories we're looking at, is this general label of crime describes a lot of things. It describes crimes of violence, it describes what I would call crimes of profit, it describes social crimes, crimes where society decides, well, that should be illegal. Mal in se, mala prohibita, we talked about that before. Um, so I think they can interact. I think it can offer partial explanations. Um, Now, the possibility of change, this is Moffat, Sampson, Loeb, says, and this again can go back to um, factors that affect stability. So, one of the things we know is that if you are married, you have a lower propensity towards crime. If you have a stable job, you have a lower propensity. Now, does that mean you have a stable job in a marriage because you have the characteristics that you were born with, or you learn the characteristics that you desire marriage and desire a job, or were you born with them? So the emphasis here would be on reforming the individual or his immediate environment, create incentives for stability, rehabilitation, self-actualization. And you can see how all of these things taken together might point to certain problems. So if you look at rational economics theory, Anome theory, social disorganization theories, you can look at the overlap of where the problems come from, at least among those. And we're not talking about rational choice here. Poverty, inequality, lack of social capital, imposition of social norms. All right, let's look at drugs as an issue here and see if this helps us untangle this Gordian knot. Now, I'm sorry I used that term, but this very complex thing. A Gordian knot actually goes back, and now you're going to have to tolerate me going off on a tangent. Alexander the Great, purportedly, when he was invading the Persian Empire, what was called Asia, there was a place called Gordia, which had this huge knot of rope. And the legend or the prophecy was he who could untangle the knot would conquer Asia or Persia. So no one could do it because it was just so complex. It was so tight and you couldn't move things. And so Alexander comes up to the Gordian knot and he just takes a sword and cuts it. So crime is in many ways a Gordian knot. It is so complex, and we're looking for that single explanation. We're looking for that single theory, like, this is what causes crime. But I think when we look at drugs and crime, which is a very complex, I think it starts to point how tough it is to come up with single explanations. So first of all, let's look at some of the quick facts here. Look at drug use. And we're talking about illicit drug use. We're not talking about do you take an aspirin, or legal drug use, or maybe pleasurable drug use if we talk about alcohol. About 138 million Americans drink alcohol. And if you look at the population of the United States, it's in the mid 300s. About 2/3 are going to be adults. So we're looking at about half of all adults drink. And then about 64 million Americans smoke cigarettes. Again, that would mean about a quarter of all adult Americans smoke cigarettes. Now, the illegal drugs, 27 million. That number is harder to arrive at. We have pretty good numbers, and we're pretty confident in alcohol and tobacco. But illegal drugs are a little bit harder. I would say that's probably a low number, roughly 30 million, or maybe 6 or 8% of the population. But that number easily could be doubled. I don't think it could be much lower because we've got some pretty strong actual numbers, but I think there's a lot of undetected drug use. There's a lot of mild drug use. For example, I think most people that smoke marijuana their entire lives are never asked if they smoke it, and they're never caught smoking it. At least enough to go to jail and come to the attention of the authorities. Okay, so what are the impacts of drugs? Let's look at some of these. Drunk driving. Drunk driving kills 10,000 people a year. There are more people killed in drunk driving accidents. And this could be running over a pedestrian who's drunk and wandering into the street. That would actually be a drunk driving fatality. Or it can be someone driving the car. And 88,000 or 90,000 people die from alcohol every year. Now let's look at the big one, tobacco. Tobacco kills about 500,000 Americans every year. You know, we just went through the COVID epidemic in the United States, and we just passed the 1 million mark. And it took COVID 2.5, almost 3 years to kill, 2.5 we'll say, to kill 1 million Americans. Well, tobacco kills 500,000 Americans every year. It's the COVID crisis every year. And 40,000 of those are killed from secondhand smoke. They're not smokers, but they live in smoking environments. Drug overdoses, and we're just looking at fatalities here. Drug overdoses, primarily the fentanyl, the opiates, the heroines, kill over 60,000 people a year. So not quite as bad as alcohol, certainly not as bad as tobacco, but very serious. Approximately 1 in 4 violent crimes are linked to alcohol use in some ways. You know, there are some crimes that are associated with certain drugs. Crimes of violence tend to be associated with alcohol more than others. I think because you probably all know someone who drinks and is a mean drunk, or you've at least come across them or heard stories. But if you take a drug like, say, marijuana, which I'm not recommending as a recreational drug, you don't meet too many people that smoke marijuana and get violent. Matter of fact, I've never met any. Okay, but even homicides are not predominantly drug related. And I think this points out that even if you take a crime of violence like murder, okay, there's lots of different types of murder. So yeah, you might say, okay, well, drugs have a root here, let's fight drugs. But look at this chart. If roughly 300, and we're looking at drug-related homicides, if we look at all of the potential homicides that occur, drug-related homicides enough, you'll notice total homicide number there, roughly 600. Drug-related homicides, 300. Only half or less than half of homicides relate to drugs. So even if you say, okay, this causes that, you're only offering a partial explanation. Okay, so why do people use drugs? Let's look at this practically. There's lots of theories. First of all, most people use drugs safely. If we take alcohol as our drug, about 12 to 13% of alcohol users are alcoholics. These are people that have a real problem with alcohol. Well, that would mean that 80 to 90% of the people that drink can drink socially, can drink casually. About 9% of marijuana users, although you're not physically addicted, they seem to be in an abusive relationship or an abusive level of use of marijuana. Also, so don't think that we can say all drugs are the same, both in the level of addiction, the propensity towards addiction, the dangers of use, the damages that come out of it. Of course, you know, if we harken back to some of the things we talk about, you know, drug use, one theory is that it is a learning process. You learn to use, you learn the pleasure of use, you learn the social experience of it. Others say, well, there could be a genetic or chemical tendency towards addiction or use. So, you know, famously, I'm Irish American. There are a lot of Irish American drunks, alcoholics. You know, there might be because the Irish population was genetically relatively isolated. You might say, okay, well, there were genes that developed in Ireland that couldn't process alcohol correctly, so when they were exposed to it, there's going to be a larger percentage of people. And you might say, well, that sounds crazy, Mr. Chapman. Well, you know, take something we do know that this is definitely true, not a field of drug. Let's talk about lactose intolerance. Europeans domesticated the milch cow, which is cows that give milk. And they, for centuries, milked cows. And those people in Europe that couldn't tolerate lactose in milk didn't have the advantage of being able to drink milk when there was a lack of food or when there was no substitute. So they were less likely to pass on their genes. Fast forward several thousand years. Most Europeans, particularly Northern Europeans, can digest lactose, right? So they have adapted to the cow. But you go to certain populations like Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa is not ideal for cows because primarily there's certain parasites that will prevent cows from living well if you don't get rid of them, tsetse flies and others. So Africans grew up without milch cows over their genetic history. Okay, so African Americans are brought to the United States and the New World, and fast forward to today, and if you looked at populations in the United States, what you'd find is more African Americans are lactose intolerant than white Americans. They each have exposure to it, but because of this genetic predisposition, which is because of their ancestry, um, fewer African Americans can digest milk. Okay, drug addiction and dependency. Drug abuse is the use of a drug that causes harm to the user or abuser. 90% of first-time users do not become abusers, but 20% of alcohol users drink 80% of the alcohol consumed. So most people are social drinkers, but there's this core that isn't. And you can be addicted physically addicted. Your body physically craves it. So alcohol, you will have physical withdrawal systems, or it can be psychological. Now, marijuana is a little bit more complex, but marijuana is primarily a psychological addiction, not a physical addiction. And we think, and it's not necessarily the same for all drugs, that the neurotransmitter dopamine is triggered by certain drugs that people ingest, and that makes it feel good when you take them. The problem is, as you take these drugs and the chemical is released, there's less and less that is released every time you use it, so you drink more and more. You have to get more and more of the drug into your body in order to get that pleasurable sensation. And at a certain point, if you're not putting it in, even if you're not getting the pleasurable sensation, you begin to suffer adverse effects. All right. Three general relationships can exist between crimes and drugs. First of all, drug-defined offenses: making, production, transportation, sale, or purchase of illegal drugs. Then there's drug-related, supporting the drug trade. And finally, there's lifestyle. 2/3 of those arrested in the United States have drugs in their bodies, alcohol being the dominant one. The recent studies show that the presence of drugs increases the likelihood of violent behavior, and we're talking primarily alcohol here, by a factor of 7. That's why we sometimes call it an enabling factor. Some people can't commit an act of violence unless they're drunks. Famously, during the Second World War, the Nazis formed groups of people that went around to shoot Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, anybody they hated. These groups, when they went into Russia, were called Einsatzgruppen, special action groups. And one of the things that was true about them is, and true of the concentration camp guards that ran the death camps, was they were drunk a lot. It enabled people to do these horrible things. All right, let's talk about the opiate epidemic. There has been an opiate addiction problem in the United States in the last 20 years. The deaths have increased an astounding 500%. There are direct and indirect costs for all these drug users across the planet, across the United States. Total cost may be as high as $1.4 trillion, including $500 billion in economic loss and 800 or 900 billion in societal harm. These are huge numbers. This is our drug overdose. You'll notice that, hopefully you'll be able to see this arrow. You'll notice that kind of orangish line. These are your fentanyls. And you can notice that fentanyl barely makes the chart. You know, a few hundred people dying in 1999. And today it's 40,000. It by far is the worst. Now the prescription opioids, you can see they exploded as well. These are the Oxycontins that people got. They got bad. Cocaine has made a bit of a comeback. Heroin came back. It seems to be actually peaking. Some of the antidepressants, some of the depressants, not as bad. Okay, but the crisis only became a crisis when there was a dramatic increase in non-white Hispanics. So you'll notice that the rates for or raw numbers for the blacks and non-Hispanics were fairly constant over the last 20 years. But this opioid crisis we talk about becomes the crisis when a certain group in society, white non-Hispanics, start to suffer. And now we start to focus society on that. Now part of that's going to be the raw numbers. There's more white non-Hispanics in the society. Part of that, I think, is going to have a social or political explanation. Okay, some different models of addiction. Let's turn this back towards criminology. You got the medical model. Essentially, users are addicted and physically driven to use. Here, as our response from the criminal justice system, you're going to say, we've got to treat them. So you treat it as a medical issue. The criminal model of addiction, which harkens back to our free will, says, why did Bob drink? Why did Fred take the drugs? They chose to do it. So how do I prevent that? Go back to free will. You emphasize penalties. You emphasize, dealing with, uh, dealing with it by increasing penalties and making it less likely people select it. This leads, of course, to a debate. There is a legalization debate. We're guessing that legalization, first of all, would end about a $40 billion black market. It would remove the stigma from conviction, and it would transfer the one from a negative, enforcing this, to a positive, the income. There has been rising support for this, and in North Carolina, the North Carolina Senate just passed a medical marijuana bill this session. I don't think the House is going to take it up or pass it. It's much harder. The House functions differently in North Carolina. And they are going to debate between, do you legalize or keep it criminalized? Again, though, I would say, if you want to know most dangerous drug in American society, this marijuana debate is silly. Most dangerous drug in American society is tobacco. It kills 500,000 people. And you're probably saying, well, those people choose it. Yeah, but people are addicted to tobacco. Nicotine's a highly addictive substance. Well, people don't go out and use tobacco and kill other people. Grant you. Okay, except maybe secondhand smoke, which we looked at. So let's look at alcohol. Alcohol, people go out and kill themselves. Cirrhosis of liver is a common disease. Heart disease is linked to alcohol use. But also, we've got those 10,000 people killed every year in drunk driving accidents. So, part of this is an appreciation of who uses marijuana, how dangerous it is. I'm going to, one of my last slides I'm going to show you here, if not the last slide, is Portugal. Portugal is a fascinating country. Portugal had fairly high rates of drug usage. And what they did is they went to a decriminalization. Essentially, about 20 years ago, they legalized for personal use. Now, it's not an open street market. They legalized most drugs. They just didn't go to marijuana like the United States' experiment. They went whole hog. So one of the things they did over the 15 or 20 years they did this is, first of all, they cut overdose deaths by about 90%. So you remember, most of those fentanyl deaths, most of those overdose deaths are because people are overdosing. We've got 60,000. You could cut that if Portugal's model held up to 6. HIV. One of the primary ways that AIDS, HIV is passed among population is people share needles. When Portugal decriminalized this and allowed people to have ready access to clean injectable needles, they cut the rate of HIV diagnosis because of needle sharing approximately 92%. And then they cut their incarceration rate for people in prison for drug offenses from about 4,000 to about 1,000. And a lot of those people, of course, they're no longer, the people remaining are probably people that are larger dealers, not users. Can you replicate this in America? Boy, that's a hard sell. Are we Portugal? We are not. But I think, this begins a discussion about decriminalization, and it also really harkens back to, why are people doing things? What is the harm? Okay, criminology from theory to practice. Criminologists have argued that chronic offenders commit most murders, most robbers, most rapes. And this is called the 6%. So if you could find those 6% early on, you could say, okay, here's 100 juveniles that have gotten in trouble. These 6% here are going to be your chronic offenders. If you could somehow emphasize them and put a lot of effort into either controlling them or reforming them or whatever, kind of depends what theory you embrace, then great, you can dramatically affect a lot of violent crimes: murder, robberies, rapes, assaults. It's difficult, though, because you're predicting the future. We have all these different risk assessment practices, ODARA, for example, being one. How successful are we? How good are we? We're not great. When you've got those 100 juveniles looking at you and you know that 6 out of that 100 are your real troublemakers, which means 94% of those there aren't, do you say, well, I'm just going to punish the whole 100% so hard that an irrational choice, I'm going to be able to stop them? Or do you just pour resources in there to the whole 100 and miss the 6% because you've spread your resources out against people that probably aren't committing a crime? This is your problem when you're moving from the theory to the actual practice. All right. I will be, and it'll take a while for me to do these, so they may not be immediately available, be creating some micro lectures about old theories and new theories, major criminological theories. I may actually do a whole subset of those, depending how long this textbook remains our standard. And I am going to do some follow-up because a lot of my early data on this, I really need to go back and look at the Portuguese experiment because I think it's important to follow up. I mean, some of this data I presented to you is more than 5 or 6 years old. Okay, well, that was about an hour there. I hope you enjoyed it. Whenever you're ready, we'll move on to Chapter 3.